Hey guys, and welcome back. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Faith, and today I'm so excited to be introducing a new series called Let's Talk. Basically, it'll be a 101 series explaining whatever the vegetable or plant that series will be, that episode or YouTube video will be dedicated to that day. So today, the first up is Let's Talk Tomatoes. I've been wanting to do this video for a while, but there is just so much to say about tomatoes, and I kind of wanted to wait a little bit where maybe I had some stuff to show you, but not wait so long that you won't be able to use this knowledge during your growing season. So let's get into it. So, and I did want to say that I'm going to try to keep everything as short and concise as possible so that this isn't an extremely lengthy video. So if you find anything that you have more questions about and want me to go over it more in depth, just let me know in the comments and I'll try to go back over that. So the first thing you need to know about tomatoes is that there are kind of two types. You have your determinate varieties and you have your indeterminate varieties. So determinate varieties are kind of your bush and dwarf tomato plants. They grow up to be a determined size with a determined amount of fruit, and you'll get kind of a bumper crop. They're really good for places that have a short growing season, because tomatoes typically, if it's an indeterminate variety, need a long growing season. So then you also have your indeterminate variety, which just keeps growing. It doesn't have any sort of set size. It'll just keep growing until it gets taken out by disease or you. So that's kind of what an indeterminate does. It is kind of more of the vining. I say tomatoes are vining, but there's really more of a sprawl. They kind of sprawl out, and their goal is to put down roots and keep spreading. So that is kind of how the indeterminate variety grows. Tomatoes do prefer temps between 50 and 95. So you want your nighttime temperatures to be above 50. They can handle a little bit of cool, but not too much, so definitely no frost or anything like that. And then once it starts getting above 95, it's going to be too hot for the tomatoes, and those flowers are going to start dropping. So if you live in a really hot area like I do here in Florida, just to make sure that you're placing your tomatoes in a place that possibly could get some afternoon shade to help counteract all that heat, so that your plants will be much healthier. Tomatoes definitely prefer a sandier soil over a clay soil, and there are several different types. So first, and actually maybe it'll be helpful if I walk you around and show you some that I have here. But first we have the currant, which I don't have any here. They're really, really tiny. So it'd be really tedious to pick, and I'm just not really interested in that. Although I do think if you were interested in having a cut flower garden, the currant tomatoes would be so cute in like a floral bouquet, so it could be good for that. For me, it's not worth the time to pick tiny tomatoes because they're very little. All right, let's walk around real quick. So then you have your cherry tomatoes. And there are several different types of cherries. So you have your cherry, your basic cherry. Then you have, over here in the shade, you have your pear varieties. What else can I find? And then your grape varieties. And someone's taken a chunk of mine. Then you have your saladette varieties, which are kind of more the small globe size. They're really good for cutting up in salads. I actually really love saladettes. I don't know why I didn't buy any seeds for some, but that's kind of the saladette size. Then you have your slicers. People often refer to these as beefsteak. Beefsteak is actually an heirloom variety of tomato, which I also have growing here. And so what a lot of people mean by that are those really big, juicy tomatoes that people cut up and use that way. So while a lot of people say beefsteak, they're really talking about a slicer. So then you have your paste varieties, which I don't have an example to show yet in my garden, but those are basically more meaty tomatoes with kind of less juice and seeds that are good for making sauces and things like that for putting up and storing. You also have your red varieties, which in taste is going to be more acidic. You have your yellow varieties, which are going to be more of a sweeter tasting tomato, and then you have black and purple, which are very savory. Oh, and green too, which I think are also more kind of on the acidic side. So those are your type of tomatoes and taste. There are several different ways that you can choose to grow your tomatoes. Like I said, if you're growing an indeterminate variety, its main goal is to sprawl out and keep spreading. So here in my garden, I choose to do vertical gardening and keep mine really pruned. That's because here is really humid, and I'll get into some of the issues with humid climates and tomatoes a little bit later, but it really helps for me to have good airflow in my plants. I've seen a lot of people, if you live in a very dry climate, or maybe less humid or hot than it is here, I've seen people create really big tomato cages and just kind of let them bush out and grow up into the tomato cage and let them do that. I've seen people stake their tomatoes. I've seen people have like a string and then grow them up the string. I've seen 2 trellises and then kind of twined, using like twine to keep the tomatoes growing up in between the 2 trellises. There are all sorts of ways that you can grow your tomatoes, and it basically depends on your climate and where you're at. So like I said, here in Florida, it's very hot, very humid, and tomatoes can get wiped out by disease very easily. So I choose to grow mine vertically, allow plenty of space. There's no right or wrong, and anyone who tells you like this is the way to grow your tomatoes, please don't listen to them. It really just depends on where you're at and what you find. Just do a trial and error maybe. There's no harm in that, and you can just do several different varieties, different ways, and just see what works better for where you're located. So tomatoes need a really long growing season, like I mentioned earlier. So it's helpful if you start your tomatoes indoors, if possible, from seed, so that way they have the best start possible. That, or purchase them from a nursery that's already been started indoors for you. If you are going to purchase them from a nursery, make sure that they're not really leggy. Bigger is not always better when it comes to purchasing stuff or plants from a nursery. A lot of people tend to think that, but actually it's gonna stunt the growth of your plant because it outgrew its space too soon. So you really wanna try to find the healthiest looking plant, but that doesn't necessarily equate to the biggest plant. So don't look for, you don't wanna have really long, leggy looking stems. And I don't really have an example of that to show you. And with tomatoes, it can be kind of difficult because kind of look leggy anyway. But if you can find a bushier plant or a smaller plant, that's gonna really help you. So when it comes to planting them in the ground, you wanna remove the bottom few leaves, set of leaves, and then you're gonna wanna bury that plant in the ground. And that will really help establish a healthier, bigger plant, because what a tomato does, because it's naturally wanting to sprawl, it has little nodules, or basically just like little places where it wants to set roots from that stem. So if you bury it in the ground, it's gonna start growing roots from the part of the stem that's in the ground, and it's gonna establish a healthier plant. And if you have purchased a small plant, or some of your starts are starting to blossom while it's still relatively small and you're just now about to put it in the ground, go ahead and remove those blossoms so that it can focus on getting bigger and healthier before it starts trying to flower and produce fruit. So if it's trying to produce fruit, it's going to spend most of its energy and resources into producing that fruit versus getting bigger and growing in other ways. So when it comes to watering your tomatoes, you're going to want to have tomatoes like very deep and regular watering. And when I say regular, I don't mean every day. You don't have to water them every day. You just want, it could be a 3-day interval that you come out and deeply water those tomatoes. The roots need a chance to breathe for them to really grow effectively. So they don't want it, you don't want your soil to be too moist or soggy rather, but you do want it moist, just not too overly soggy, if that makes sense. So when you're purchasing seeds or trying to find the type of plant that you want at a nursery, there are two different types of tomatoes besides indeterminate, indeterminate, and the different varieties of slicers and saladettes. You also have what is called an heirloom variety, and you have your hybrid varieties. So your heirloom varieties are the kinds that have been passed down from generation and generation. They stay the same, you can know what to expect with those. And then you have your hybrid varieties, which a lot of people kind of freaks them out, but it's not inherently bad. A hybrid variety just means that that plant has been crossed with a different tomato plant. And so the main key to look for when you're looking at hybrid varieties to make sure that you're not having something genetically modified is open pollination. So if you find an open pollinated plant, that means that that has happened naturally or set up to happen naturally, so that it's happening from natural cross-pollination. You can have cross-pollination within your own garden from a little bee taking pollen from one plant or the wind carrying it from one plant to another tomato plant. So a hybrid variety is not technically or necessarily a bad thing, it just depends on the type of hybrid variety. That also brings me to another point, which is that tomatoes are self or wind pollinated. The flowers do have both parts within the blossom, so if you want to help, which you don't necessarily have to, but if you want to try to help your tomato plants along, you think you're having pollination issues, one, if it's a really dry place, that pollen could not be sticking. Two, you could try to slightly tap the blossoms and make it vibrate to make some of that pollen fall within the flower to pollinate the female part of the flower, since there are both parts within the blossom. So that can help some of the pollination issues. When it comes to tomatoes, there are definitely several different things to watch out for that could wipe out your tomato plants. So, or just issues that you could be having with your tomato plants and wondering how to fix it. So one of the first ones that comes to mind is blight and fungus issues. And since we've already kind of been talking about water a little bit, blight or bacterial wilt are things that can crop up when it's very humid or late in the season, and your plants are just starting to develop bacteria from it being so moist and not being able to dry. So there are several ways that you can kind of help to counteract this. One, like I was saying earlier, no matter how you're choosing to grow your tomatoes, if you keep them pruned back by pinching off any suckers or actually I'll show you what a sucker looks like in just a minute. But if you pinch those off and keep it pruned to more kind of one basic stem, that's gonna, and then give your plant some space, that's gonna help allow good airflow so that your plants can dry out. This right here is what's called a sucker. And so what you would do is you would just pinch this off. I'm not doing the best job of that one-handed. And try to keep your tomato pruned back. There's another one right there, so that it has good airflow. I will say that I personally do choose to let at least one sucker develop so that I have a two-stemmed, basically, kind of tomato plant. And towards the end, they kind of get a little wild. That's kind of how I do it. I usually just let, if you're having a real bad issue, you could definitely keep it to one, but I kind of let one sucker develop so I can have like a two-stemmed tomato plant. So the best thing that you can do, keep your plants pruned and bottom water your tomatoes. Tomatoes really do well if you tomatoes really do well if you bottom, why can I not say that? Tomatoes really do well if you bottom water them instead of having them spray overhead. Of course, you can't do anything about the rain, But if you're choosing to water, if you're trying to water your tomatoes and need to water your tomatoes, it's best to do it from the bottom so that you can try to eliminate any sort of splash from the soil that could help produce bacteria that way. It doesn't get the foliage all wet where it's having to dry off and dealing with humidity that way. So really try to bottom water your tomatoes. Another issue that you can have that could be based on watering is leaf curl. If you see that your tomatoes are starting to dry up and the leaves are curling, that could be because it needs some water. Another one could be from the result of uneven watering is if your tomatoes start to crack. So if you notice that your tomatoes are getting cracked, that's basically from uneven watering. So if maybe it's gotten really dry and you haven't watered in a while, and then all of a sudden you have a big rainstorm that just soaks your soil, those tomatoes are going to grow very quickly, which causes them to crack. You can have hornworms, which are basically, I don't know if you've ever seen kind of what's called a hummingbird moth, but that's basically what a hornworm is. They basically kind of look like a small little mothy hummingbird. They have a very long beak, but if you see those in your garden, keep an eye out for hornworms on your tomatoes. They're green and big, and they will eat down your plant. The best thing that you could do for that, if you want to stay organic, is make like a neem oil spray, and I'll try to include a link to something or do another video on how to make that another day, and then spray that on your tomatoes to kind of help ward that off. And if you're looking for hornworms, I've also seen people use a black light to really look for hornworms at night, and that somehow eliminates worms. I have personally never done that, but if you're having a really bad issue, maybe give that a go. Another one tomato issue is blossom end rot. So if you're having a tomato and you turn it over and you see that the whole bottom of it is kind of black and rotted, that is because, and this could also be a result of watering, it's not getting enough calcium to the plant. So sometimes if you overwater your plants, there's a lot to do with watering if you haven't noticed. If you overwater your plants, your tomatoes can't absorb the calcium from the soil. I've seen that you can amend your soil with like crab meal, you can amend your soil with crushed eggshell powder. I've seen people mention that you can put Tums in your plant. I've never done the Tums, and all of those can help give you some more calcium to your plant. The last issue I want to talk about is if you have a cat-faced tomato. And if you've never heard that term, it's basically the result of what's called a fasciated blossom, where two tomato blossoms have kind of fused together to grow one plant. So this is very hard to explain without having tomato, but what you have is basically a kind of fused tomato where two tomatoes kind of fuse together when it grows, and you could have some sort of rot developed in that. It's not necessarily bad. It will make some part of your tomato inedible. You just cut it away and eat what's left. It's not the worst thing in the world, but if you're wondering what that's from, it's from a fused blossom. You can kind of keep an eye out on your blossoms ahead of time if you don't like that and pick them off. Starter reference, this is what a normal blossom would look like. I don't know if it's focusing. So that is a normal blossom. I think I found one. Hopefully I can show this without ruining my plant. This, can you see that? Is a fused blossom. You can tell that looks drastically different than just a normal blossom right there. Lastly is harvesting. You want to harvest your tomatoes on a more dry, hot day, and that's because it's gonna make the sugars in the tomato more concentrated so that it'll taste better. So harvest them flat if you can. I don't always follow my own advice on that. Store them flat on a dry surface, not necessarily in the refrigerator. Those are all the things that I could think of in relation to growing tomatoes that I've learned over the past year. If you've been here for a while, you know I had lots of issues growing tomatoes last year, so I've really delved into a lot of research, particularly on tomatoes, because I just could not figure out where I was going wrong. And if that's you, I hope that this will be helpful and provide some guidance on finding the right tomato plants, growing tomato plants, taking care of those tomato plants. So I hope this helps. Until next time.